Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Today we shall be jumping into the fascinating world of early Zionism. During the second half of the 19th century, a political ideology arose among Jewish circles that was at the same time distinctly modern and unmistakably ancient: the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel under their own sovereignty. Yet from the start, Zionism included a wide array of sub-ideologies, subsuming within it divergent and often hostile factions. It was not until the final years of the 19th century that Zionism got off the ground as an organized international movement, and this, of course, was largely due to the vision and leadership of Theodor Herzl, one of the most extraordinary Jewish leaders of modern times. The ideas and currents within Zionism in general, and the activities of Herzl in particular, are endlessly intriguing, and here to examine them with us today is Derek Penslar, the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. He was the president of the American Academy for Jewish Research and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and he is the incoming director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University. His books and articles range across numerous subjects, including modern Jewish history, Zionism, anti-Semitism, European history, nationalism, and colonialism. His most recently published book, a biography of Theodor Herzl for Yale University's Jewish Live series, is a fascinating and important exposition of Herzl's life and works, a subject we will be discussing at length today. We are very fortunate to have Professor Penslar joining us today, and thank you for coming on to the podcast of Jewish Ideas.
Thank you. Very nice to see you again, JJ.
Thank you. Okay, so let's jump into it. So as I mentioned, Zionism arose, one could say, in the latter half of the 19th century. And the question that I want to begin with is, why now? Why at this point? What was going on during these decades which allowed for this intellectual ferment? And what were the conditions that enabled it to come about?
Well, I think it would have been rather odd, given the political atmosphere of the late 19th century, if a Zionist movement, that is to say a Jewish nationalist movement, had not arisen. After all, the Zionist movement's stronghold was Central and Eastern Europe, and it arose in the later 19th century, which is a time when nationalism as an idea and an ideology is sprouting up all over the place. And it has a particular meaning for the stateless peoples in the polyglot empires of the Austro-Hungary and the Russian Empire, and also the Ottoman Empire in Southern Europe, and then eventually in the Middle East as a whole. So the idea that groups of people are what are called nations, that they have distinct histories, cultures, languages, and so forth, and that those distinctions have to be preserved through some level of autonomy, self-rule, perhaps independent statehood, that was all rather up for grabs in the late 19th century. But it is overdetermined, to use a popular academic phrase, meaning there's a lot of reasons why. Some forms of Jewish nationalism developed. Now, Zionism is not the only type of Jewish nationalism. There were Jewish nationalisms that focused on creating some kind of Jewish autonomy within Eastern Europe, where most of the single largest concentration of world Jewry lived. There were nationalisms that wanted to build some sort of Jewish homeland, well, anywhere where they could find a place. You know, it could be somewhere in North America or South America, or who knows, anywhere. It's called territorialism. And then there were various forms of nationalism that were much more like assertions of ethnic pride. And in many ways, Zionism could be that. That is, Zionism, as we're going to talk about, had many varieties, and some of the, I would say, the softer varieties of Zionism were really an assertion of a Jewish ethnicity, even though people didn't use that word in the early 1900s. That's really what we would describe it as. So, and again, it's particularly the case that nationalism flourished among stateless peoples. Yes, of course, there was German and French nationalism, sometimes rather toxic nationalism. But the oppressed and persecuted stateless peoples in the empires of, again, Europe and the Mediterranean were particularly attracted to nationalist ideology, a form of empowerment, a search for dignity and honor, and their place in the world.
Interesting. So Zionism obviously had a place within these various nationalisms, as you mentioned, within these polyglot empires within Europe and beyond, which brings, of course, to the reverse question, which is, was there anything qualitatively different about Zionism to all these other nationalisms cropping up at the same time? Was there a quality that they had which others didn't? Many
qualities. I mean, the fact is that all nationalisms are distinct, just as all bodies are distinct, all discrete entities are distinct. And Zionism certainly had some unusual features, if not unique, then distinct. For example, the fact that Jews were a scattered people, although concentrated for the most part in Central and Eastern Europe, where something like half of world Jewry in the 1920s and 30s lived in Central and Eastern Europe, but half didn't. So Jews were scattered all over the world. The fact that if there was to be a homeland for the Jews, most likely in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel of the Bible, the Jews would actually have to create the preconditions for their own existence, which is a bit of effort. That is the acquisition of land, the construction of a national economy, the construction of cities into the countryside, the creation, installation of some kind of national language. I mean, all of these things that are the building blocks of a nation would have to be constructed. So what did unite the Jewish people was a sense of historical consciousness, obviously common religious identity, but even more important, in the words of the nationalist theoretician Ines Renan of the 1880s, a common fate. And that term, common fate, or in German Schicksalgemeinschaft, or Communauté de Destin in French, was used actually in Hebrew, Kehilat Yehud. This term was used already in sort of the last quarter of the 19th century, that what unites the Jews is that they're united by fate, even if they're not religious Jews, even if they're secularizing. So, but Zionism lacked many of the other aspects of a nation. And so it was that much more, I think, Herculean to actually realize this project. So no, Zionism is distinct in all kinds of ways.
A natural follow-up question to this is, what was unique about modern Zionism? Because, of course, one could argue, and many have argued, that the idea of the restoration of the Jewish people to that specific land and under their own sovereignty is in some degree an ancient idea. It is an idea almost as old as the Bible itself, and this notion that exile is a curse and that the Jewish people ideally belong under their own sovereignty in that land, and certainly under certain, say, religious laws or religious purview, is it runs throughout the Jewish religion itself. So could modern Zionism be disentangled from this at all?
Right. This is probably the most delicate, difficult question that is, at this moment, probably tearing the Jewish people apart.
Which is why I asked it to you, of course.
It can't be disentangled from it, but it's a hugely delicate question. And really, it's probably the underlying source of the ideological tensions that are tearing the state of Israel apart, about whether we see Zionism as fundamentally a modern and inherently secular project, although it might have all sorts of religious strands running through it, or if we see it as fundamentally connected with a Jewish messianic religious tradition. So on the one hand, of course, you're right. The Jews are a collective, and they're described as such in the Hebrew Bible. Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, Israel being the second name, or the new name of the patriarch Jacob after his encounter with the divine angel at the Jabbok River. We are all, as it were, the people of Israel, the sons and daughters of Israel. So we're a collective, and the nation is a familial kind of extension. So, and there is a notion in rabbinic writing and through the Middle Ages and early modern period of an eventual return, Shivat Zion, right, an additional return of Jews to the land of Israel, which is associated with the Messianic age. However, although there have always been Jews living in the land of Israel, they were living there largely until really the later 19th century as pilgrims, but sort of what I would call long-term pilgrims. That is, it's not like they go and then go back. They live there, but they form a community, but they have no real intention of forming a collective nation state or anything in the modern sense of the word until the Messianic era comes. And when the Zionist movement began, there were many Orthodox Jews, probably the great majority of Orthodox Jews, who found the Zionist movement bizarre and even sacrilegious, because it was a violation of the divine commandment to accept the curse and to live in diaspora until the Messianic age, when Jews would return to the land of Israel. And as you know, there is quite a lot of debate within the rabbinic tradition, as on so many other things, about whether or not Jews should not, must not live in the land of Israel. And you can sort of, pick through the text. I think it's in Ketubot about, whether you should or shouldn't. So sure, the idea of peoplehood is there. But in the 1600s, for example, when the Jewish world in Eastern Europe was shaken badly by a series of uprisings in Ukraine, many Jews were killed, many were taken into slavery. there was, as the scholar Adam Teller writes, a international sort of religious community of Jews who felt obliged to help refugees, to save, to redeem Jews who had been taken into slavery. But he makes clear this is a religious community. It's not defined by language. It's not defined by any kind of ethnicity. It's not defined by a sense of common fate. It's defined by a common religious identity, and that's very strong. But it's not quite the same thing as modern nationalism. But this is something where, again, to this day, not just scholars, but everyone has a different opinion about this in the state of Israel. And it's not surprising that there's a certain stream of Orthodox Zionism today, which would indeed argue for unbroken continuity in the Zionist idea going back to antiquity. And it's not surprising then that more secularly oriented Jews would emphasize the relative modernity and novelty of the Zionist idea.
As an aside, I mean, you mentioned that a large portion of orthodoxy during the time of early Zionism rejected it, and it wasn't only the Eastern, shall we say, ultra-Orthodox or parochially Orthodox communities who did so. I remember reading recently the writings of the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom at the time, Dr. Adler, who was fervently anti-Zionist. He called it an egregious blunder and believed that this was, most certainly the wrong direction in which to go, which I thought was fascinating as well, that it certainly wasn't limited to that community. Before turning to Herzl himself, I wanted to ask another question about Zionism, which is that Zionism should perhaps at the time be better called Zionisms, because it seemed that under this one umbrella, there were lots of sub-ideologies or particular ideological strains, many of whom were mutually antagonistic towards each other, or mutually exclusive in a way. So could you perhaps walk us through a few of those at the time?
Sure. It was the late Israeli author Amos Oz who wrote that Zionism is a family name with many first names. And for example, if you're a Zionist whose goal, first and foremost, is to create some kind of state or political unit for the Jews, and you don't care all that much or think all that much about the content of what that state will have, what kind of language will be spoken, what culture it will have, that's called political Zionism. Then there are other kinds of Zionism that emphasize the intertwining of religion and nationalism. I mentioned how so many Orthodox Jews opposed Zionism. Well, there were some who supported it, very important people who supported it. So you have various forms of religious Zionism. And then you have a Zionism which has absorbed a lot of the social ideologies of the late 19th, early 20th century about the need for global revolutionary change in the means of production, in relations between classes, a kind of utopian desire to create an egalitarian society, which we associate with various strands of socialist ideology, Marxism, non-Marxist left-wing ideologies, and this whole tissue of what we might call the left in the early 20th century informed many nationalist movements. And you have various forms of socialist Zionism, or what was called at the time labor Zionism. So there was a very powerful, well, it became powerful, a labor Zionist movement centered around the ideas of returning Jews to productive labor after centuries of being, as it were, compelled to engage in commercial activities. Labor Zionism became the dominant political force within the Yishuv, that is the Jewish community of pre-1948 Palestine, and the Zionist movement worldwide. It became very powerful in the 1930s and remained there for 40 years. And then about half a century ago, it fell from grace and was replaced by other types. So there are these kind of fundamental building blocks of Zionism that go way back to the early 20th century, whether religious or secular or more statist. And then there are various forms, the last thing I'll talk about, of cultural Zionism, where you're trying to create some kind of modern culture, not based on rabbinic texts alone, but a modernized Hebrew language, one that is just as supple and able to express complex human feeling as modern French or modern German or modern Russian or whatever. And you have a literary renaissance of the Hebrew language, production of Hebrew novels and newspapers and scientific books and the like. And this is not always, but it's often tied up with Zionism. Zionism is a kind of cultural awakening of the Jews. And that's very typical of lots of 19th century nationalisms, Polish nationalism, for example, creating all kinds of Polish literature and scientific inquiry and the like. So no, there are many different Zionisms, and you can see why they would disagree with each other and how difficult it was for anyone who led the Zionist movement to balance the interests of these various groups.
Interesting. I'd actually like to ask something which has bedeviled me a little bit when I've read on this topic, which is that, as you mentioned, a large or powerful faction within the Zionist movement was this international part of the left, part of the socialist left, and sometimes even the communist side of socialism. But that always puzzled me a little bit, because generally this kind of ideology is somewhat hostile to nationalisms, and in fact prefer to see the sort of global proletarian class and speaks to their interests and tries to advance their cause. And it's curious to me that early Zionist ideologues were capable of meshing the two into one ideology, kind of a very fervent nationalism intertwined with this internationalist left concern. Were they aware of this contradiction? Was that something that bothered them?
The interesting thing about that period, really until World War I or even a little later, it wasn't a contradiction. What you're talking about is a kind of ex post facto projection, because the socialist movement internationally in the late 19th century was quite sympathetic to nationalism. So what was known as the Second International, so these various socialist organizations, they were Polish socialists, they were Ukrainian socialists, they were Czech socialists, they were Jewish socialists. And international socialism actually celebrated the community of brethren, as it were, from their different nations.
Without flattening the national differences, you're saying?
Well, this notion of distinct national cultures, for example, and what became known as Austro-Marxism, the kind of Marxist theory that developed within the multilingual, polyglottal, whatever, multinational Austrian Empire, was by definition sympathetic to nationalism. So the contradiction actually didn't exist. And even in the Soviet Union, the official policy of the Soviet Union from the 1920s onward was a celebration of national difference, all within the single, they didn't use the word imperial, but all within the overarching state of the Soviet Union. So the so-called universalism of socialism is something that we shouldn't exaggerate, that there's always an openness towards nationalism. Workers of the world unite. German workers of the world unite, Polish workers of the world unite, and you won't stop being German or Polish if you're part of this organization. So the Zionists didn't really have to feel that they were living a contradiction.
Okay, let's move on to the certainly the most famous and arguably the most influential of the earliest Zionist leaders, namely Theodor Herzl, about whom you wrote quite an excellent biography, which I thoroughly enjoyed, actually. And so let's talk a little bit about him and his life. So first, I want to say that it was something interesting in the biography is that you argued that the story that everyone knows about Herzl is something of a myth, in the sense that this notion that he was just a regular Viennese journalist in Paris, and suddenly he sees the Dreyfus trial and the injustice against the Jews and the riots against the Jews, and overnight he turns into a Zionist, and begins to agitate towards the Zionist cause. And there's the sort of this point, this shifting point that one can discernibly point to. And you argue this is actually a later myth imposed on the life of Herzl.
Sure, Herzl was a human being. And look, national movements need saints, and they don't write biographies, they write hagiographies. I think about the way that George Washington or Abraham Lincoln were discussed when I was in school in the United States growing up. These are not real human beings full of complexities. And what's been going on really ever since the 1970s is an openness, at least in some circles, to deal with any Zionist leader as a complex human being. And I think now in the 21st century, all the more so. No, Herzl was himself an extremely complicated human being, deeply troubled, psychologically troubled. And the fact is that, yes, he did become a Zionist because of anti-Semitism. That's true. But lots of people in his world were exposed to anti-Semitism and didn't become Zionists. So, what led him to that is not necessarily that he had prophetic powers that other people did not, but he was sensitive, and he was deeply hurt by anti-Semitism. He had a very strong desire for honor and sense of dignity. His Jewishness was a source of pain as well as pride. And yes, anti-Semitism eventually turned him to Zionism, but it was a slow process. I mean, really a couple of years or even several years before he turned to Zionism. He was thinking about what was called at the time the Jewish problem. He was writing about it. He was thinking about maybe all the Jews in Europe or in Austria should convert to Catholicism.
But not him.
No, but not him. But he thought, well, maybe and he brought this idea up with the editors, the Jewish editors of the newspaper he worked for, and they thought he was quite mad that there'd be a massive conversion ceremony at the big main cathedral in Vienna, presided over by the Pope. And Herzl himself wrote he wouldn't convert out of pride and loyalty to his family, which is very interesting. So Herzl was jumping around. And then something quite terrible happened, which is the rise of the charismatic Austrian politician Karl Lueger, who kept on getting elected to be mayor of Vienna, and the emperor kept on refusing to approve the appointment until finally he relented. And this man was just openly, instrumentally anti-Semitic in Herzl's beloved Vienna, not his birthplace, but the city he moved to when he was in his teens. And he loved and he worked there. And I think that actually predisposed him towards some kind of radical search for a radical solution to the Jewish problem, even aside from going to Paris. And if you actually look at his writings from Paris during the time of the trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, there's nothing in his writings, either public or private, to suggest that this moved him to become a Zionist. He only mentions Dreyfus for the first time long after he's become a Zionist, like 18 months after he's become a Zionist. So I'm not saying it didn't play some role, it may have, but there's so much more evidence given the timing that it's really more related to events in Vienna. And I'm not the only scholar to argue this. It's funny, there have been scholars trying to make these points for many years, but it's a very popular and deeply held belief. And I think it's because of the way we want history to run. Because we're all trained to think about history in terms of novels and movies and television programs. So we want these great dramatic climactic moments. The road to Damascus. Yeah.
Right. We do like this idea of, Herzl sort of standing on a balcony in Paris and watching the mobs inflamed with anti-Jewish hatred and thinking, I know how to solve this. So Herzl, he develops this slowly, but he does write, apart from his various private writings and also his essays in newspapers, etc. He has famously two books that are generally read and quoted nowadays: the sort of political manifesto of the Judenstaat, the Jewish state or state of the Jews, and Alt Neuland, the old new land. And what I want to ask a little bit is, did Herzl add anything to Zionism intellectually, or did he have any new ideas in terms of political philosophy, or was his genius that he distilled already ideas that were already around, or that he advocated so effectively or organized so efficiently? Was he a thinker as such, or merely a popularizer?
Well, there's controversy. There's controversy about this. I think that there are many people in the state of Israel, for example, who would argue that Herzl was a serious political thinker. And sorry, my own views are a little different. I do see him as a great leader, but I think you're onto something that, the idea that Jews need to organize, that already in the thought of Leo Pinsker in the early 1880s, right? So, that idea. The idea that Jews should be actively involved in pursuing their own redemption or rescue had actually been pioneered by Orthodox rabbis like Yehuda Alkalai.
Kalischer and others.
And Kalischer, a decade or two, a couple of decades before that. So what did Herzl have that was new? Largely, it's a question of organization and thinking through the organization. What's ironic is that those ideas that he had that were the most deeply thought through and the most original were the ones that didn't take hold. So, for example, you're right, he writes these two books. He writes a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, which is the beginning is what all the people ever read, which is anti-Semitism is a serious problem. We need to solve it and so forth. And it's very well said. And then he goes into this like mindless technical detail about how the Jewish homeland shall be constructed, and very few people read any of that. Then we have his novel, which is filled with ideas which today, by many people in the state of Israel, would be considered anti-Zionist. After all, he envisions a future Jewish homeland in which Jews and non-Jews have complete and total equality. It is a community of all of its citizens. The Arab character in the book, Rashid Bey, is a member of the select body that essentially governs, the elite body that governs this Jewish society. So one idea is complete and total equality, regardless of ethnicity. Another is complete and total separation of church and state. As he writes in Alt-Neuland, actually he writes this even in the Judenstaat. He writes something about how the rabbis will be kept in their temples, in their synagogues, and the army will be kept in its barracks. So that's in the Jewish state. So complete separation of church and state. And who is the villain in Alt-Neuland, in Old New Land? It's a rabbi, Rabbi Geyer, German for hawk or vulture, who opposes the, as it were, mixing of Jews and non-Jews in this Jewish homeland. And at the end of the book, spoiler alert, he is defeated in his candidacy for election to run the new society of Old New Land. And who wins but a genial, tolerant East European Jew, but of a very cosmopolitan sort of orientation. So this is actually Herzl's most deeply held views. And the state of Israel didn't exactly realize them. So it's interesting that Herzl did care passionately about certain things, and he had very, I think, important ideas about them. And yet those are the ideas that, as it were, got left on the cutting room floor.
Interesting. There's also, and you've made this point, and others certainly have made this point, that to some degree Herzl had imbibed some anti-Semitic stereotypes or anti-Semitic beliefs almost about Jews. And in a way, his work helped anti-Semites because he was convincing them that he'd actually get the Jews out of Europe. Could you perhaps speak to that for a moment? I mean, his views about Jews and their activities were not necessarily that flattering.
They weren't, but I should point out that self-criticism is a very typical characteristic of the intelligentsia in nationalist movements for ethnic reawakening, and so forth. So if you look at, for example, the African-American community in the United States in the mid-20th century, you find self-criticism. We need to educate ourselves. We need to behave in a certain way. And the self-criticism among Jews goes back to the Jewish Enlightenment movement of the late 18th century. There's something wrong with us. We need to learn modern languages. We need to learn how to adapt and fit into the, our surrounding world. It's not unique to Herzl, but I think that in the German-speaking world, there was a particular combination of both the possibility of full acceptance and the existence of anti-Semitism. And it could lead many Jews, Germany, Austria-Hungary, to become self-critical to to an extreme point. To think of Jews as anti-Semites did, as unproductive, engaged in petty commerce, perhaps not prone to engage in shady business practices, and that this is something that goes way beyond Zionism, that we leaders of the Jewish community need to, for example, encourage more Jews to become craftsmen and farmers and engage in productive labor, and so forth. So Herzl is actually not unique in this, except he does represent a certain type of, middle-class German-speaking Jew of his era. So he does have views of Jews as there's something wrong with them. And for him, the main problem is not that they're unproductive, it's that they lack honor. They lack dignity. And for Herzl, the most important quality a human being can have would be honor and dignity. And for him, Zionism is very much a way to restore the Jews' honor. But Lev Pinsker writes exactly the same things in his pamphlet, Self-Emancipation, 14 years before Herzl's. So, and he's a Jew from Odessa. He's not a German Jew. So we can't somehow blame this all on Herzl or blame this all on Germany. It's a very common Zionist trope that there's something wrong with the Jews and we need to change it.
Of course, before you have a prognosis, you need a diagnosis, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's a problem. They agree that there is such a thing as the Jewish problem. That's a non-Jewish idea. I mean, Jews aren't a problem. The problem is the non-Jews. in real life.
So this brings me neatly to a very interesting issue, which is that Herzl wasn't all that popular among fellow Central and Western European Jews, especially of the middle classes to which he belonged. He actually found his main support among what he would have called the Ostjuden, Jews from Eastern Europe, who certainly in the minds of many Western European Jews were seen as, how do I say this, somewhat backward, somewhat benighted in certain ways. Why was this? Herzl seemed to greatly appeal to people who were absolutely nothing like him and whose circumstances and backgrounds he would have had very little sympathy with.
Well, I think that's exactly why he appealed to them, because he was Moses. He was the man raised at the court of Pharaoh, the prince with his, first of all, his actual position in society, upper bourgeois, from a fairly well-to-do family. His wife was extremely rich, so he married into a wealthy family. He is arguably the most prominent journalist at the most prominent newspaper in Central Europe. So he's a man with tremendous, as we would say today, cred. He has a very, quite a high reputation. But he is also a man from the outside. And the narrative, we go back to mythological narratives of the Prince of Egypt, who discovers his people, returns to his people, is extremely powerful. And I think a number of the Lovers of Zion movement's members, this was a kind of very early form of Zionism from the 1880s, they would write, like, we would never accept one of our own as our leader, because we're just East European Jews. There's a kind of familiarity there. We're all just, we're all products of the same shtetl. But Herzl, and his appearance certainly added to it. He was a very handsome man. He had, he simply was possessed of very powerful charisma, which frankly, there were some Eastern European Zionists of that era who had a tad of charisma, but no one like Herzl. So it's a combination of his position in society, precisely the fact that he came from the outside. It was one of the founders of the anti-Zionist Agudas Yisrael party, who wrote at the time of Herzl's death. So, he would go on to become a founder of the Aguda, because the Aguda is founded only in 1912. He writes, I'm not a Zionist, but he admired Herzl. And he wrote only someone as assimilated as Herzl would have had the chutzpah to do what he did, right? To bring together world Jewry and to go and appear before to meet with the Ottoman Sultan, to meet with the Pope, the King of Italy, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, the Interior Minister of Russia, the Kaiser of Germany. He's, so they're in awe of him.
Completely, of course, on his own authority, because nobody elected him to any position. He just took the mantle of leadership and ran with it.
Yeah.
And this is a fascinating part, I think, of Herzl and just of Jewish life at the time as well, which is that if you take a look at the early Zionist conferences, they're very interesting in that there's a lot of showmanship about it. Wearing crisp dinner jackets and in ornate surroundings and with grand speeches and as though they are some vastly powerful international movement. Really, they're a collection of Jews who'd gathered in Basel or in London or wherever else they were gathering. And there seems to be a great deal of performance, sort of as though if one acted as in one manner, then one would become that.
Absolutely. Herzl was a master of fake it till you make it. Herzl was, after all, a playwright and a journalist and a writer of fiction. And he was very much the impresario, right? He knew how to create. He was inventing a myth, and he knew that he was inventing a myth as he was creating the Zionist Congress and the Zionist organization. Force the delegates to wear evening dress, give the event a kind of solemn tone, and he's quite explicit in his writings about what he's doing and why. It all goes back to dignity, and also attracting attention. Get the world press to come to the congresses, get them to report, and Herzl himself embodies this. So yeah, he's a showman, but I think a showman in a very positive way.
Interesting. So let me latch on to this point of dignity and honor that you've made a couple of times. This is very important. It certainly shoots through Herzl's writings. You're about to publish a book soon called Zionism, An Emotional State, which, very good, is a clever pun. So well done on that. But I mean, obviously I haven't read the book; it's not out yet. But I assume that the claim that you're making is that emotions are important to the development of Zionism and stand somewhat at its center. And it seems to be the case also in Herzl's life. So can you perhaps walk us through the claim of that? What do you mean by an emotional state and emotions being at the heart of Zionism and Herzl's endeavors in general?
Well, I think that the mise en scène for the book was about how, when we think about Zionism, it tends to be presented either as ideology, a series of ideas, or just practice, building up political parties and eventually the institutions of a state. But ultimately, any nationalist movement is an expression of affect, of emotion, of need, basic human needs, solidarity, security, belonging, comfort, honor. And when you feel that those things might not be attained, you express negative emotions like fear. Fear is, after all, there's no distinction really in real life between rationality and emotion. Fear is a sort of cognitive state in which the object of your desire, whatever it might be, you think that you're not going to get it, or you haven't gotten it. And then when you think you are going to attain that object of desire, you feel various positive emotions, love and hope and happiness and so forth. And this is true for all national movements. They are deeply emotional creatures. And study national anthems. They're all expressions of longing and pride. And so Zionism is just one of many. So for the Zionist movement, of course, it's deeply affective. It's rooted in need, in yearning, in hope, fear, and from time to time, anger, frustration, and hatred. It spans the entire range. Herzl embodies, I think, a man who, again, he is hurt emotionally by anti-Semitism. He also is looking for a purpose in life. He doesn't really like just being a journalist, but that's a more personal thing. He sees in a Jewish state the fulfillment of his own and, by extension, the Jewish people's needs. And again, Alt-Neuland, it exudes pride, because there's a kind of a chorus figure in the novel, Old Newland, who is this Prussian aristocrat named Kingscourt, this old, crusty Prussian aristocrat, his main job in the novel is to talk about how impressed he is by everything about the new society. And basically, it's a non-Jew, a Prussian nobleman of all things, basically giving his hechsher, his stamp of approval, so that Herzl, as he's writing this, can say, yes, look how wonderful we are. Look how he loves us. Therefore, we are worth loving. So it's very much about the fulfillment of emotional need. And Herzl's a particular case, but I think it runs through the Zionist movement like other national movements.
And presumably, these emotions were also harnessed, or certainly on display, in his 9 years of frantic activity between sort of his conversion, let's call it, or at least public declaration of Zionism, to the time he drops dead at the age of 44 of a heart attack, and his frantic running around the world, meeting with everyone and trying his best to convince everyone and anyone who has any kind of power or influence to convert them to the Zionist cause. I assume that the appeal to emotions was important or at the heart of his one-man diplomatic mission.
Well, there's his own emotions, and there's the emotions he wants to instill into or evoke from his audience. So I think it was the German ambassador to Vienna who was quite taken by Herzl and writes, Herzl's the most magnificent creature, not a whiff of the, I think how to translate it into English, Schacharjude. He isn't at all like the kind of businessman Jew, money Jew. So for people who are inclined to anti-Semitism, to get back to where we were earlier, Herzl is like, wow, look, he's so noble and dignified. And this is the kind of Jew we should have. So he can impress anti-Semites and Jews the world over who were Zionists. And, it was a minority movement. Still, there were over 100,000 Jews who belonged to his Zionist organization when he died, and many more were sympathetic. Herzl was a kind of father figure, an inspirational figure. Again, his charisma gave them hope, and it filled them with pride and all kinds of positive feelings. And then when he died, they were bereft. I mean, Herzl's funeral was a mob scene. The Jewish world was simply torn asunder with grief. So yes, the emotional expressions here are powerful, and they're essential.
Was that instrumental in creating what might be perhaps uncharitably called a cult of personality, in the sense that Herzl, I mean, even now in Zionist, in the state of Israel and other places, the picture of Herzl, him standing on the balcony, looking out into the distance with his big beard and his magnetic eyes, and you just feel this, that around his picture and his dmut, his
image, yeah,
his image, his features, that retains a power, I suppose, even till this day. I mean, it must have been enormously powerful in his time.
It was hugely powerful. And, when the state of Israel was created, then every classroom, every government office, I mean, even to this day, right, there can be a picture of Herzl on the wall. But Herzl is what we would call a floating signifier or a meme, in that he can mean anything. I mean, if you're left-wing, you say that, you read Alt-Neuland and you say, you see, Herzl predicted the labor Zionist values of collective agriculture and an egalitarian society. If you're on the far left, you say, you see, Herzl wrote of complete equality between Jews and Arabs, so he would want a state of all of its citizens. If you're on the right, you say Herzl saw the ubiquity of anti-Semitism, and that Jews must, basically take shelter in a Jewish state. If you're on the religious right, you can say, rather improbably about Herzl, that he had a religious reawakening because he went to synagogue before the Zionist Congress, and because he did write, and this is true, he wrote on 2 different occasions, that ultimately what unites us is faith. One of the weird things about Herzl is that he himself is not a religious person, he's not observant, but he does understand the complexity of what makes a Jew a Jew. And so he, is it culture? Because he writes once quite emphatically, it is not race. We are not a race. We look too different from each other.
Which is actually something that many Jews in the 19th century, Disraeli especially, would claim quite trenchantly.
Yeah, and
that Jews are a race.
Yeah, no, he rejects it. So what are we? And it's like, well, we're united by faith, but then, we're not observant. And so it's very complicated. So Herzl, I think, gets out of this problem, as so many Zionists did, by saying in the Jewish state, people will do what they want. If people want to go to synagogue and be observant, they will. And if they don't want to, they won't. And for some reason, that very simple idea has not quite worked in practice in the state of Israel.
Yes, well, exactly. Certainly in some circles, the idea of the rabbis keeping themselves in their temples and the army in their barracks hasn't quite manifested, at least not at this moment. One final question before we end. It's sort of almost a fun question. Is if you could sit down to lunch with Herzl, what would you and you could ask him something that you didn't manage to get in your biography? What would you ask him?
Well, I'd probably want to know, first off, just how he did it. I think he didn't sleep much. He had an indefatigable work ethic, but simply how he was able to balance a full-time job as a journalist with all of his Zionist work. The hardest thing about Herzl that I still don't understand is to what extent he believed his own PR. That is, when he writes to world leaders saying, we Jews can raise huge amounts of money so that we can retire the Ottoman national imperial debt. Did he believe that? When he, Chaim Weizmann, for example, who was a much more, I think, savvy politician than Herzl, Chaim Weizmann knew that it was not true. But the British thought that Jews had financial power, and Weizmann never disabused them of it, because he knew that it would help him. Herzl...
Let sleeping dogs lie.
Herzl may have believed his own wishful thinking, and about the capacity of the Jewish world to organize, and about the possibilities for a future Jewish homeland. I mean, he was a visionary. And visionaries often don't really know the difference between the possible and the impossible. But of course, if people aren't visionaries, then things don't change. Herzl is a man who envisions something which was impossible at the time, the creation of the Jewish homeland. And then, as he writes, after the first Zionist Congress, within 50 years, there will be a Jewish state. Well, guess what? It happened. I think, just to finish, though, it happened not because of him. I mean, he was an inspiring figure and an essential figure, but the Zionist movement was extraordinarily lucky in that at just the right time, it had 2 other great leaders. Herzl's the man who creates the movement. Fine. Chaim Weizmann is the man who then negotiates, creative figure than Herzl. And then last, we get David Ben-Gurion, the political machine, as it were, machine politician, the man who actually creates and builds and defends the Jewish state. If we hadn't had all 3 of these people, And if they hadn't arisen at just the right time, it's very hard to imagine the state of Israel as having been created. So I'm sorry to say this in a world full of social history and history from the bottom up, but Zionism actually proves the truth of the great person theory of history.
Wow. That's quite a statement, Professor.
I mean, I'm not saying that these people alone could have done it. Look, just consider recent political developments in the United States or in the state of Israel, whether one likes what's happening or not. Donald Trump is an extraordinary individual whom many Americans adore and many absolutely loathe. He has changed history. Now, I personally do not think he has changed history for the better, but he has changed history. Of course, the great individual is a necessary but not sufficient condition for major political change. And in the case of a national movement, unlike a pre-existing state, the need for the individual is even greater because there are no institutions to sustain or to develop the national project. Herzl creates everything from scratch, right? He has to invent it all. And that's why his charisma and his appeal are so important. Without that, you have no successful Zionist movement. Chaim Weizmann inherits a Zionist movement, but he has to approach the international community and the greatest empire in the world and win its support for the Zionist project. That's no mean feat. And then he has to keep together, to get back to where we started, this very diverse collection of Zionists with many different approaches to Zionism and try to keep them together in the 1920s and 30s. And eventually he's spent and he's ill. And although he becomes the president of Israel, he's literally a figurehead. And then we have the actual need to develop the national economy and the army and the political infrastructure, the kind of things Weizmann could never have done that. Herzl could never have done that. But Ben-Gurion could and did. He was a man of indomitable power and, again, capacity and intelligence. So you can have leaders who accomplish great things for the good. You can have leaders who are quite destructive, but they are ultimately absolutely essential. And especially when it comes to the creation of a state, an anti-colonial movement, a national movement, and so forth. So to get back to where we started about great ideas, so as you can see, I'm not a historian of ideas. I'm a historian of what I call Zionism as a project to create a Jewish homeland. Ideas played their role, and you can talk about other people who are experts in that. But I'm, as you know from my work, I'm very interested in the people who made things happen. And what makes Herzl so great is that he made things happen, and that, yes, you asked if he was a popularizer. I don't know if popularizer is quite the right word, but he was an inspirational figure. So this is my own view of what the Zionist project actually needed to realize itself. What it needed once it did realize itself in 1948 is an entirely different question, and perhaps we can talk about that another time after I finish my next book.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So we have a tentative date for a year or two, or whenever it is.
Yeah.
And we can discuss that then. But this is fascinating stuff, and of course, all that we've said today is extremely thought-provoking from now in the future, because of course, charismatic leaders do make a huge difference. And then the question is, which charismatic leaders are necessary for which time periods?
Right.
Is a continual issue. Wow. Okay. Professor Penslar, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit TorahInMotion.org/donate.